So this may seem like a curious way to start this video about Harlequin flower scarabs. Their species name is Gymnetis thula. The reason I'm starting the video this way is to show you this cup. It's a 16-ounce deli cup, and I received this group of adults very recently from a friend and a breeder of them. He's been working with them for many, many years, and you can see that there is very limited ventilation in this lid. Some pinholes, rather perfectly and evenly spaced, I might add. And I don't see any holes on the side, just in the top there. It's stuffed rather full and densely with moist paper towel. You can see that there's just enough airspace in the bottom, through the sides, and on the top, so that the beetles could move around a little bit. And that's a really good way to ship. It's not entirely necessary, but you can see that the beetles are doing very well in here, and that they've even done some tunneling there through the paper towel corridors. They move up and down through it, space each other out a little bit. And one of the really interesting things about this species, and why they have been consistently available in the pet beetle hobby for a couple decades probably now, is that they are so very easy to reproduce in captivity. And one of the reasons I wanted to start this video out this way is because just right there, you can see an egg, and then two more eggs right over here. These beetles are not picky at all about what kind of substrate they deposit their eggs in, which can be a real problem when raising certain other beetle species that are popular in the hobby. Now, it is ideal for them to be on a substrate. I can tell you from experience, however, that these eggs will hatch within a few weeks' time, maybe sooner. Not sure when they were laid exactly. Got this cup just a couple days ago and haven't moved the beetles out yet. Sometimes I leave them in these shipping cups so that they will not deposit their eggs quite as readily, because I want to pass them on to my customers filled with the eggs, but inevitably a few are deposited while I'm waiting to reship these out to my own customers. See one of the beetles moving just a little bit there. The reason that there is so limited ventilation in this lid is because it will help to prolong the beetles' lives. Dryness is their #1 enemy. And kept healthy and somewhat moist like this, and obviously in a different habitat, which we'll explore here subsequently. We'll do a setup, build a cage to show you how to properly keep them here a little bit later in the video. But these beetles should live around 6 months on average from the time they emerge from their pupal cells, and we don't always know exactly when that is, but we tend to ship fresh specimens, of course. Give or take a couple months, half a year is about what you can expect from these. They feed very nicely on a variety of fruits, sugary liquids. We usually feed them little jelly cups, which I'll show you later as well, when we keep them as pets. In nature, they fly around. They're diurnal rather than nocturnal. Most beetles are nocturnal. But these ones They fly around during the day. The sun activates their flying muscles. Even though you can keep them at room temperature, if you want to see them flying, you really do need to warm them up somewhere above 75 degrees. And as this one is out in the air for a few moments, you will gradually see its colors change. It will go from that almost black coloration entirely to a very bright yellow. I think even in this short time since it's been out of that cup, you can see the lighter portions starting to lighten. It's got some fibers on there, I think, from the paper towel. Those little white strings are not usually a part of the beetle. So one of the indicators to healthy beetles that you're keeping them at the proper humidity is that they are somewhere around this coloration right here or a little bit darker. If you keep them in a hot, dry cage, they'll be yellow all the time, a really bright yellow, again, that you'll see here in a moment. And that's an indicator that you are probably keeping them too dry. And really, in extremely hot and dry conditions, they can dry out in probably even under a day if it's terribly dry. But a couple days at extreme dryness is definitely too much. So I recommend always keeping a slightly moist substrate in with them. And that's important too for the beetles, the adult females, to feel comfortable in laying their eggs. There, it's really starting to yellow up now. And also for the larvae as they move through the substrate column, feeding on decaying wood, and especially in the case of flower beetles like these, decaying leaves. These beetles are called flower beetles because in nature they fly around during the day, visiting flowers, feeding on nectar and pollen. Get a close-up here of the face and the antennae. See the eyes there, the head moving almost robotically. Now, because this room that they're in is currently at about 70 degrees, this beetle is very slow moving, not too active, but left to dry out like this for a few more moments, it will become more active. I should mention also, and I might be able to get one of them to do it. Oh, well, that one did it just fine. They do have secretion, this defensive fluid right here. And it's fairly unpleasant in this species. Now, this one over here didn't do it at all. And I picked this one up with intent to produce that liquid. And it probably is very distasteful. It doesn't smell real great. You have to really kind of hold it up to your face to get a good whiff of it. I'm going to wipe my hands off there on the paper towel. But you can imagine a bird or something chowing on one of these beetles and getting a mouthful of that. And generally, nothing that comes out of that end of an animal is going to be too tasty. So that's the defensive ability of this beetle. And another thing that these beetles do really well, and it's probably hard to imagine it right now because this one's a little bit on the chilly side and rather immobile, but they fly extremely well. Many beetles are clumsy flyers. These ones, however, their wings come out from either side of their bodies, and sometimes certain beetles in the subfamily flower beetles, now they're scarab beetles. Scarabeidae is the family, but they're in the subfamily Cetoniinae, and sometimes they're called bumblebee scarabs, or at least certain ones are. And they all fly rather like bumblebees. If you're in an area where flower beetles like this occur and are flying, they will sound very much like bumblebees or some kind of bee. And if you're from Oregon, like I am, I guess, you might think for sure it's a bumblebee. Little fly. Until you see it, get a close eye on it. So that's about it for the adult here. We're going to let this one color up here. It's developed a nice orange coloration, but you'll see in a few moments that it's a very bright, vivid yellow color. Black and yellow, like a bumblebee. One other thing to note here is that the patterning on their backs is variable. They're sort of a general pattern, but I always sort of compare them to a Rorschach test. And that'll be a little bit more evident once the yellows show up. So I'm going to turn off the camera for a few moments, pop a few of these into a drier container, and then we'll check on them. This one here has really yellowed up quite a bit. Not quite warm enough to really move very quickly, although I should note that they do also play dead. As a defense mechanism, the reason that some animals play dead is because their predators have learned that eating dead things in nature can make them sick. And so it's a pretty universal and proven method. Set this beetle here for a few moments. We'll grab these other ones here, which are a little bit more active. Still a little chilly, and so they're not holding on to the surface of this lid quite as vigorously. This over here, in case you're wondering, is a mantis egg case from Popa spurca, an African twig mantis. I'll take some more close-up shots of these beetles at this point while we wait for them to activate. And I'll really put them under some heat here in a few moments so we can get those nice flying shots. But you see those hook-like tarsi there on the tip of each leg. That, of course, helps them to hold on to textured surfaces. When you have them in a tank, it's best to have some wood or some bark, branches, things like that for them to hold on to. They really have a lot of trouble holding on to smooth surfaces, and if this beetle were to end up on its back, unless it were warm enough in this room for it to fly, it could potentially get stuck on its back like this because it can't reach down, much like a turtle. It can't reach down and right itself, flip itself over like that. And so over the course of a day, it would probably dry out because it couldn't get to shelter, like a moist substrate somewhere. Would dry out and wear itself out, sort of flailing and moving its legs around, trying to flip itself over. So one of the tricks to getting beetles and other things to fly is to put them on a stick like this, to where they walk out to the very edge. And often, instead of turning around, they will take the opportunity to move along to another place. Now, it would help if this twig were angled up at a 45-degree angle instead of horizontal like this, but we'll try this first and see if it works. We'll try this again a different way. It's always sort of hard to wrangle these things. So let's see if this works. That's a better angle. The beetle is more likely to take flight when it's up at the tip in a more vertically oriented position. And so I'm just going to back off and we'll watch, see what happens. Might just be a little too chilly in this room for it. Well, that answers that. Now we're going to do it again. Hopefully without the annoying little fly buzzing through right before the best moment happens, and in slow motion. We're going to talk about the adults here for a few minutes and what to feed them. It's a really great book, by the way, written by Orrin McMonigal, The Complete Guide to Rearing Flower and Jewel Scarabs. And this covers both these beetles, the Gymnetis thula, Harlequin scarabs, as well as jewel beetles like Cressina gloriosa, Bayeri, and Leconti, 3 of the US species. Cressina woodii is another one that I have on the website now and then. And this provides care instructions, everything from information about the species, some of the other popular ones in the hobby, including some of the exotics. There's our Harlequin Flower Scarab right there, actually. Highly recommend this book. Lots of great care information. The source of pretty much all information for caring for this species in the hobby, I would say. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the foods. This here is a jelly cup. These are very popular. They don't really attract pests. They're very long-lived. They're not going to mold like fresh fruit would. You can use fresh fruit for these beetles, but you just peel this little lid off here, and this product is pretty much good to go. Just pop it down here into the substrate, and the beetles will come right up to the edge of it and start to feed on it. Another thing you can do is get drinking cap lids. This is from a water carton, a water jug, gallon, milk jugs, same thing. This is from a Gatorade bottle. I've got some pebbles here that I got from outside. You just drop those down in there, and you can mix sugar and water and pour it in there. The purpose of the little pebbles is to prevent the beetles from drowning. This is very shallow. Even if the beetle were resting in the bottom of this, it would poke out the top a little bit there. You can still see it. But just as a precaution, since their spiracles, their breathing holes, are on the bottoms of their bodies, their abdomen in particular, you don't want to give them any opportunity to drown. And so by sinking a few pebbles in, and this works for most pet bugs if you want to give them a drink of some kind, just sink those pebbles in there, fill it up with a little bit of sugar water. It doesn't really matter what the ratio of sugar to water is. You don't want to see solids in there, the sugar granules. Just mix a little bit of sugar into water, maybe cover the bottom with sugar, and then pour a little bit of water in, stir it up so that it becomes a liquid, then sink your pebbles in. That works. These little cup lids, they also work well if you were to put some fruit in there. Peaches, pears, kind of softer fruits I would recommend for these. Apples and mashed banana, apple sauce, things like that work. These beetles aren't too picky about what they eat. These beetles will lay tons of eggs, by the way. Because a female can live 6 months, give or take a couple months, she will be producing lots of eggs, maybe in excess of 100 eggs. I'm not really sure, but they are very prolific. And I should probably show you some of the close-ups of the eggs here, and we'll do that now. So, right there, next to my fingertip, a Harlequin scarab egg. You can see that it's relatively round. I think it might have a little bit of paper towel fibers stuck to it, perhaps. Relatively round, though. And in here, I popped in the adult beetles from their more humid enclosure. And also an example of one over here feeding on this jelly cup. I think the light kind of startled it a little bit there. There we go. Happily feeding on that jelly. You can see the mouth parts popping out there a little bit from underneath the head. So mostly they are liquid feeders, or they feed best on liquids, but they can negotiate somewhat solid foods. But the mushier the better. Larvae are usually shipped in cups like this. It's about the right size for a larva, and usually they can live in these no problem for a few weeks, a month maybe. If the grub is larger than this one, if it's perhaps going to become a pupa, form a pupal cell, it's better for it to be in something larger. An 8-ounce cup is definitely large enough for a single larva, and even multiple larvae. When you get the cup like this, you see all this substrate in here? See those fecal pellets in it? Those things and this entire cup of substrate should be dumped into whatever other container you're going to be putting them into. And if you have adults, it's always good to have some of this substrate on hand too. Not entirely necessary, as noted previously. They will drop eggs like that, even in moist paper towels, but it is believed that many flower beetle larvae, it's not necessarily as important with this species, but many flower beetle species do like to have some of that frass, those droppings in the substrate where you're going to be putting your adult females, because supposedly it promotes egg laying. And so I always recommend to people, and because of the microbial balance also, you have to imagine that these beetles are consuming wood and various composted organic materials in nature, or even when we're keeping them as pets, and primarily decomposing dead leaves, old leaves, dry leaves, crumbled up leaves that are then moistened in the rearing container. And so they're feeding on those. So the substrate, as they eat it, it passes through their gut systems. And there are some symbiotic bacteria and microorganisms in there that help them to digest these substrate materials. And by adding a little bit of that into your new media, your new substrate, whatever they were in before, just dumping the whole cup in there, or adding a little bit of your old substrate if you've purchased some new substrate into the new substrate, that's a good idea because it helps to maintain and achieve that microbial balance. So here's a pretty common method for keeping beetle larvae separate from each other. These bead organizer boxes. They probably fall under a few different names when you're buying them. But one of the unique things about the flower beetles, about these Gymnetis, is that you can keep multiples of them in a single container. They're communal in that respect. They don't bother each other at all. Now, if you had huge numbers of them in very small spaces, and they were old enough or large enough to begin pupating, they could potentially damage each other, but I've had them in small containers like this many times, and I almost can't remember seeing any actually disturb each other during that pupation process. They might hold off a little bit longer, but it does seem that eventually, in this species at least, that they will all eventually pupate. And so keeping them in individual cells might be a good idea. They'll compete a little bit less for resources if you get a little lazy and aren't replacing the substrate frequently enough. And you can see here that this is rather fresh looking substrate. It's pretty much all wood fibers and not too much frass yet. You can see a few fecal pellets in there, like this. That's passed through the digestive system of the larva. But by and large, it's mostly wood flakes or wood fibers. You don't have to use this more expensive processed, and by processed, I mean it was specially made for beetles through a process of fermentation, but you don't have to use this super high quality substrate for this particular species of flower beetles. You could almost go out into nature and collect most any kind of wood from hardwood trees, not conifers, not trees with wood on the ground that is sort of red or orange in coloration. They may not like that. Typically, wood that is soft will crumble easily in the hand. It's decayed to that point where you can do that. Now, these ones aren't as picky about highly decayed wood. It can be moderately decayed, and they may actually even prefer that. But they will also feed. Well, honestly, it seems to me that with this species in particular, there's almost nothing organic they won't feed on. But leaves are definitely the cheapest and best food for them. And I do recommend leaves, from the prior fall. It's March now, and what I do is I take these leaves and I crumble them up into little tiny pieces like this. And the older the leaves are, the more easily they crumble in the hand into these fine bits. The larvae have a better, easier time of eating leaves when they're in small pieces. They have trouble sort of negotiating the perimeter of a single large leaf. If it were unbroken like this one here is. And so in fine bits like this, they can really get around them, get their mandibles on them. And this is the favorite food for flower beetle larvae. So I do recommend you have some of that in your substrate at all times, although again, these beetle larvae really are extremely forgiving, and even if the substrate is all frass, they're not going to die in a couple months' time. They're not going to starve to death. But of course, if your goal is to raise the beetles and their larvae optimally and quickly, you should be able to get a larva like this from the time it hatches. I guess we should talk about the life cycle. The eggs, they take just a couple weeks to hatch usually. And then the larvae like this, they may take 6 months to maturity, which is faster than most beetle larvae. And then you might get another half year out of the adults. There is some variation in all of this. You can raise them more quickly if you keep them warmer. I do recommend room temperature all the way through for this species. They do really well on that. You're not taking any chances of overheating them or keeping them too cold. If you as a person are comfortable in your home, that's a comfortable temperature for these beetles. Once you start messing with the temperatures, trying to speed up production of them, you run the risk of dehydrating them or maybe even cooking them if you're using a heat pad or something like that. Heat lamps, of course. Things like that. Anything that's going to dry these larvae out is potentially a risk to them. They obviously have very thin bodies, a thin membrane around them, and they are mostly water weight, of course. And so they're very subject to desiccation or drying out. And so they're not something that you handle very often, of course. They're fun to bring out and look at, but mostly they're a sit and wait kind of pet, and it's the adult beetles that are more handleable. One of the interesting things about flower scarabs like these is that they crawl on their backs, and that can be a distinguishing feature in identifying larvae that you might find in your yard. They would be in the subfamily of flower scarabs. Scarabs is a very large group of beetles. It includes rhino beetles, and the family Scarabiidae also includes these kinds of beetles. So here's an interesting thing. These two sort of got themselves caught up in a tangle and started doing sort of a yin and yang thing, like what you may have seen in a recent slug video I made. It would be very uncommon for two of these beetles to end up on a flat surface like this, a smooth surface. And so it actually looks like they're biting each other a little bit. And so I'm going to pull them apart here. They didn't have anything to hold on to here on the smooth surface, and don't think that they will have damaged each other there. I'm going to look at the tip of the abdomen. Looks okay. But I was saying that when they get to about that size, they pupate. You can see a little fungus gnat crawling through there. I left this lid off here just for a few minutes while we were talking, and a fungus gnat has already found its way in here. They're sort of a constant problem for us pet bug keepers. But this is a pupal cell. You see it's a round, not quite a sphere, but circular. This one is in the middle of being constructed. You can see this because showing right through there is the larva still, and I've disturbed it a little bit now through my digging. It's also possible that it were up against the side of the tank there, and sometimes you can see through a window in the side, this being a window, and then through a hole that when they've sort of built it up against the side wall of the tank like this, you can watch the process of pupation happening. Now, of course, it's always a rather small window like that, and you can't really see what's going on. But with a flashlight, you can often see through the window there and tell whether the beetle is still a larva or it is a sort of orange-colored pupa or yellowish. Or sometimes you can see beetle legs in there, black beetle legs from the adult. And so you can get a little bit of an idea for what's happening. Always kind of lucky when they do it up against the side of the tank like that. It doesn't normally happen unless they're in sort of cramped quarters. These ones here were pupating a little bit sooner than I was expecting. At least this one over here did. And so I think it takes about a month with average temperature and humidity in the soil for them to metamorphose, to completely change from larvae like this into adults. Funny to watch them moving around on their backs like that. Rhino beetles, like Dynastes, and stag beetles, like Leucanus, they don't move on their backs like that. Instead, they would sort of wriggle around. Usually they're in soil and things like that, and so they have a vertical column to dig through. But on a smooth surface like this, these flower beetles in the subfamily Cetoniinae, they actually do a much better job of moving across a flat surface like this because of this technique they use for locomotion on their backs like that. They actually get around decently well enough. Kind of fun to watch. You can see a few mites have popped off of the beetles here. Try as we might, mites are almost impossible to prevent. I didn't actually even see any mites in this substrate here, and you guys were looking through it with me. But they often seem to travel from the adult beetles to the larvae, their offspring. And unless you look really, really close, you pretty much never see them. And of course, the mites, they use the beetle larvae as transport from place to place, offers them a consistent and new location for getting food for themselves. See if we can see any mites on this larva. Normally you would expect to see them up on the front of the body, towards the head. I'm not seeing any here, but let's check the other one. You can see it's just scooting along. Looks like it's wanting to change direction there, maybe because I brought the light over here. And quite fuzzy. See all those fine CT, fine hairs covering the body, and those are sensory. Helps the, oh, there comes a mite. Oh, and you can see a few of the mites tucked in there, in between folds, behind the legs. Take it in a little closer here. That mite right there. And you might be able to brush those off. I would just leave it be. It's not doing any harm to the larvae here. They just sort of come and go. So here's two sizes for containers that I like to recommend for these beetles. The one on the bottom is probably good for 6 to maybe a dozen at the most adult beetles. The one on the top, maybe 3. 3 is a good minimum number to start with if you're purchasing adult beetles. And the reason for that is you're more likely to get a male and a female. These beetles are extremely difficult to sex, and so nobody is going to be able to tell the differences between males and females that I know of anyway, unless they happen to see that the male has is basically on top of a female. These are also good containers for rearing the larvae, and you could probably have 20 larvae in this bottom one, and maybe, I don't know, even 10 larvae in that top one. It's not really ideal. As long as you're changing the substrate regularly enough, though, you can keep them in those kinds of numbers in these sizes of containers. Of course, 20 will process the substrate very quickly. These beetles really do go through the substrate very quickly, and you can supplement them with other things. You can put fruits and vegetables in there. You can put a little dog food or cat food in there. Supposedly it helps them grow a little bit. You can, if your room is like 80 plus degrees, they should grow more quickly and process the substrate more quickly. But you always have to be careful when you're messing around with temperatures. Again, room temperature is ideal. And foods like dog food and cat food, those can attract pests like mites and maybe fungus gnats and things like that if the food is molding. And so those foods aren't generally recommended, and I tell you, they're not really necessary. So I don't personally ever like to put anything like that inside of these tanks, for these beetles anyway. So I was just setting up my YouTube video here, and I had taken some video of this noisy little bird. And when I was watching the video back, I was going to put it in an Instagram story clip. Those only last 24 hours and then they disappear. While I was playing it back, and this bird, it heard its own voice in my video, and it flew right down at my feet and just sat there for a moment and made this noise back up to me. And now it just wants to be friends. It's really reacting to the sound of its own voice when I play the videos back. Funny little bird. All right, came outside, show you some substrates. Talk about proper food for the larvae. Threw a rock out of the substrate here. Got this nice compost composted materials. There's a nursery that I go to buy all of my compost. I've been shopping there for years, so I trust their products for myself and my customers. And I'm just going to use a bunch of this. I'm going to fill this bin up here. This product right here, I freeze all of my substrate. I leave in the freezer for maybe 3 days. It depends on whether you're seeing anything in the substrate. When I buy this product, I never see anything living in it in the first place, but I still freeze it for 3 days before I use it or I ship it out to my customers. I have some very large freezers just for that purpose. And some people will microwave it. I did it like that for years out on the back deck at my old house. I would just pop it in the freezer for 1.5 minutes in a container this size. I might fill it up to like right here. And I would microwave it for 1.5 minutes, and then I would pull it out, I would rotate it, I would turn it over with a spoon, and then I would microwave it for another 1.5 minutes, and then of course I would let it cool thoroughly before I used it. Another method that people sometimes use is to bake it, and the trick with that, I think, is to do it slow and low temperatures. I'm not going to give you guys any quotes on a particular temperature or duration, but basically common sense applies. Don't set your house on fire by cooking substrates, which are rather dry in the first place generally, and flammable. Doesn't take much to cause them to burst into flames. I've never personally tried the baking method. I've known quite a few people to do it. I know it smells the house up. Microwaving inside the house will also stink your house up, and spouses and family members, roommates tend not to appreciate strange lingering smells in the household. But then again, fair's fair. Sometimes they are the source of certain smells themselves, and perhaps, like I said, fair is fair. You can get back at them in that way. But really, freezing, I think, is the method that makes the most sense. Most people have room in their freezers for a container this size, and it's not going to create any weird smells in the house, and I think it's a fairly effective and friendly method. Now, if you ever see pests in your cages, you can also refreeze your substrate. Make sure you pull all your larvae out. Make sure that when you're done freezing it for a couple days, and even 24 hours is probably enough to kill adult fungus flies, and probably their larvae too. Not all freezers are created equally. The volume of substrate will more or less determine how long you need to keep it in the freezer too. If it's just a little amount of substrate, it doesn't need to be frozen for as many days, because nothing will be able to hide in the inner warmer recesses of it, perhaps. There isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of science to a lot of things in this hobby, because not everybody is using a substrate that is the same type exactly. Not everybody is using the same volume of substrate. The container size will affect how long it needs to be in the freezer. You might not even need to do it for a full day. If you put a container with fungus gnats in the freezer for an hour, it would actually kill all of the adult fungus gnats. But there could be larvae and eggs in the soil, and nobody really knows exactly how long it takes to kill them because of the other variables that I mentioned. So another trick you can do is to get a couple sheets of paper towel and cover this, maybe a layer or two of paper towel, and cover the lid, pinch it between the container base and the lid, and that will keep little fungus gnats from being able to get into your tank in the first place. And then of course, if you do have a little bit of an outbreak in there, I will often take the container outside with those fungus gnats, which likely came in from the outdoors in the first place in your area, and I'll just pop that off. Of course, if you have adult beetles in there that are capable of flying, don't pull the lid off outside, especially on a warm sunny day, because they will take off, and you should never release anything that's not native to your area into the wild, certainly. Larvae, of course, are not going to fly. You can just kind of fan the fungus gnats out. Sometimes I'll have a spoon or some paper towels and I'll kind of flick them out. You'll basically
figure it out as you're doing it, what works best. But by having that paper towel layer in there, you keep it from spreading to other things in the house if you do develop a little bit of an infestation of fungus gnats in your larval container. Temperature, room temperature is fine for the substrate. I mentioned that previously. This is not an airtight seal on this tank. It snaps down on either end here, but this actually provides enough ventilation for your larvae. Now you will want to spray in there more or less depending on the unique container you're using. You do want the substrate to always be a little bit moist. This is fresh substrate, and it actually has enough moisture in it to hold its shape here in a clump. And that's about the right moisture level. A little bit more moist is fine. You don't ever want to push your hand into a fist like this and have water droplets drip out. That means it's too moist. You don't want a mud consistency, certainly. And if it's not holding its shape, that's an indication that the substrate is too dry, and so you might mist in there. And if you have paper towel on the lid, that's also going to reduce the amount of evaporation, the amount of water vapor that is escaping this, and so you may mist in there less. But that clump the soil in your fist test, that's the best test that there is. Now, in addition to adding the substrate, I like to add it up to a certain point. The volume isn't terribly important, and the volume required depends entirely upon the number of larvae you have in there. They don't really need it deep, but offering a deep substrate does allow the moisture to be buffered a little bit. You might have some dry areas at the top levels, but moister areas down below, and by having a deep substrate, the larvae can sort of find their happy place there in the tank. And so I might put about that much in, maybe a little bit more if you want to. Always have a little bit of airspace in there so that when you open it, you can kind of see what's going on and spray in there a little bit. If water vapor is forming on the sides of the tank, that means that it's too humid in there, unnecessarily humid. It could cause problems with mold in there. So if you have fewer larvae, you might use a container like this. This would be good for 1 to 3, maybe 4 larvae. It's an 8-ounce cup, and it's not completely filled up to the top. Still a little bit of airspace up in the top there. I don't have any holes in this lid so that you can see that it's very humid up there. And so you would just poke some pinholes in the lid in this case here, because it is a fairly airtight seal all the way around. The other thing that you want to do for your larvae, once you have them in a container like this, take a bunch of leaves, crush them up, just right up here on the surface. This is their primary food. They will eat this entire substrate, everything in it, all the compost, and there are some inedible bits in there, probably little bits of rock and everything that gets into the substrate when it's commercially produced like this. You can make your own compost, of course, using a compost pit, but put a generous amount of leaves in there because that's their primary food. And then I will actually mix it into the substrate, turn it nice and thoroughly, and then add a little bit more on top. And that's important both for the larvae because it's their food, and for the adults when you're keeping them, because the females are more likely to deposit their eggs in a substrate if they sense that it's a proper substrate for their babies, their eggs and their larvae. I usually pick out these little bits of twig. This was the central vein of a leaf. Anyway, that's a good substrate and a good container size for the larvae. You have a bunch of adult beetles. This would be good for up to a dozen of them, I would say. Also good for a single pair of them, although this is a more appropriate size for adult beetles. You could keep tons of larvae in here. You could keep 50 larvae in here if you had the substrate filled up here. And again, even though this has little clamps on the side here, I would still recommend maybe putting a sheet of paper towel in there just to prevent the intrusion of pests. It's not an airtight seal there, and so you wouldn't need to mist this very often because the lid doesn't have any holes in it, the side of the tank doesn't have any holes in it, but enough air will still transfer through there. It never hurts in the case of some beetles where there's a lot of substrate in there and not very much airspace at the top to pop that lid off every once in a while. Maybe give the soil a little turn with your hand or a spoon or something just to kind of aerate it. Waste products through the decomposition of wood materials, compost materials, leaf materials in the tank, as well as waste that the beetles are creating, can sometimes foul the air and create a toxic environment for them. And so when you're operating in conditions of relatively low ventilation, it never hurts to open the container every few days and just kind of give things a quick turn. Now you want to be careful that because there could be beetle larvae pupating down there. So it's kind of a timing thing too. If you have young larvae or adults, it's not quite as significant to be turning or to be worrying about turning the substrate. But if you have a bunch of L3 larvae, you do want to be very careful with them because they could be pupating any time, and you could kill them by pushing a spoon into a metamorphosing beetle larva, or disrupt their pupation in some other way when they're preparing their pupal cells. So you want to be careful with that.
So now we're going to place some larvae into their new home. You can see that I have added the layers of paper towel here that I pinch between the container base and the container. I'll note that there's a break in this over here. I'm just using this for display purposes or demonstration purposes. I would normally remove chunks like this too, by the way. A little moss in there is okay. But what we're gonna do is put these larvae into this new container of substrate. And I'm going to add in this original substrate from their older tank or container. And that will help to maintain that microbial balance in there. And it's good, again, to have some of this frass in there. It will encourage the adult females to lay. And just remember, if Travis Perry can manage this species without any larval deaths, so can you. Hey, if you like me, give me one of those thumbs up. And please subscribe and hit the little bell so you know when I post next. Please share me with your friends on social media. Thank you for watching.